Since about 6 months after I started this channel, I instituted a hard and fast rule. Whenever there's a accusation or allegation leveled against a priest for doing McCarrick kinds of things, I usually will not report on it until the issue has absolutely been proven to be true. And I'm glad I have that rule. But I developed that rule because early on, when these stories would come out, I'd just report on them. And in those days, I used Church Militant as a source of things. But I also would take and use other websites, other news sources to sort of flesh a story out, get more details. And I distinctly remember a few times where they'd report on a story as if it was true, and then I'd go look, and the secular media, the hostile to the Catholic faith secular media, would report on it in a different way that was much more charitable to the priest. And in fact, oftentimes you would find out that how Church Militant reported on it wasn't exactly in keeping with reality. And that happened enough times to where I stopped using them as a news source. For those of you who missed them, that's why but have watched here a long time. I wouldn't use them as a news source after I caught that a few times. And that was when I instituted the hard and fast rule. And I'm glad I did, because I've gotten a few emails in the past week about Father Carlos Martin, the exorcist priest who was on tour with some relics of St. Jude. There was some things leveled against him that people took at face value, at least in the media, and then this story snowballed. And now we have more details that show that it was prudent to not just jump on board. And so we're going to launch this by just talking about Jim Caviezel briefly, not because celebrity defenses of anything make any difference. They don't. They really don't. But it's interesting that Jim Caviezel would lend his credibility in the broader Catholic community to this issue, because if it turns out that the priest in this story did something bad and Jim Caviezel defended him, that would be pretty bad for Jim Caviezel. There would be consequences for him. But he says here, quote, "One of the great gifts of our country's justice system is that you are innocent until proven otherwise." Which, by the way, that comes from the Inquisition, if you didn't know that. It's a fun fact of history they don't typically tell you when you learn American history. It says, "I'm greatly grieved when a good man, in this case also a faithful priest, Father Carlos Martins, has his name and reputation harmed by allegations that have not only been unproven, but misleading at best. I encourage anyone to look at all the current information that has been released rather than jumping to conclusions like some of the press has already done. There's nothing ethical, moral, or just about that. Thank you." Mr. Caviezel is not the only one with a Catholic of stature in Hollywood to stand up about this. Mel Gibson did too. Um, for some, Mel Gibson getting involved in this won't help the priest. I understand that he can be kind of divisive, but he also spoke about this. Uh, Point being that people have taken some great risks to talk about this. So what happened here? As the story goes, the Pillar Catholic, that's a news outlet I do use frequently, had a report on Father Carlos Martins, and it made him look like potentially the next best thing to Ted McCarrick, or at least you could easily read that into the article. The pushback they got from that article was so bad that they literally changed the article that they have posted on their website after the priest's lawyers demanded a retraction. Thankfully, the internet is forever, so we're going to look at the original version of the article for details. Bree Dale, a Catholic journalist who does work for the Daily Wire and a lot of independent reporting, she preserved a copy of the original article, and we're going to turn to her post here on X for the original article because, once again, the internet is forever. So she says, "I understand some may be confused by my criticism of the reporting on Father Martins by Pillar Catholic, as many of the points made were updated later by Condon and Flynn." Updated being in quotes. When the secular media does this, those of us who pay a lot of attention to secular news come down on them like a ton of bricks for it, and for good reason. And Catholic media shouldn't do this either. They could amend the story by putting something at the beginning or at the end saying the following detail, we got in this article X, Y, and Z wrong. Here's how it was wrong. We preserved the original article in its full entirety for transparency's sake. And then that's how they should do it. But that's not how it was done here. They say the editors have edited their initial report in several places to include links to the original statement of the parish and claiming that Father Martins has not responded to their inquiries made after they published. For clarity, here's their original report. So the headline that they ran with was "St. Jude Relic Tour Suspended Over Police Investigation." A St. Jude relic traversing the United States came to a stop this week while the priest organizing the tour faces an Illinois police investigation over inappropriate conduct with the most vulnerable, very, very young people. The priest, Father Carlos Martins, is well known for The Exorcist Files, a 2023 podcast series featuring dramatic audio portrayals of allegedly demonic encounters Martins claims to have experienced in ministry as an exorcist. According to a statement from Queen of the Apostles Parish in Joliet, Illinois, Martin was accused Thursday of an incident involving students, which prompted Father Michael Lane, parish moderator, to contact the police. The priest was confronted with the information, Lane wrote, and we informed the priest that he must depart from our parish and our diocese. While Lane's statement did not provide details about the allegations, the priest aimed to assure parishioners that all involved in this incident are safe. The police investigation is still ongoing, the priest wrote. And then they tell you about Father Martins, some of his background here. But he's known as an exorcist. And we'll talk about the problem with the exorcist culture, celebrity exorcist culture, because it used to be that you couldn't even find out who your exorcist was in the diocese. That stuff was kept under tight wraps. It would rarely, if ever, would there be an exorcist who would speak publicly about anything, typically after they stopped being an exorcist. Now, the article does conclude saying, on Saturday, the Diocese of Gary, Indiana, where the St. Jude relic was to be venerated on Monday, issued an announcement explaining that, quote, due to unforeseen circumstances, the visitation of the relic of St. Jude has been canceled. A Joliet police officer told the Pillar November 23rd that she did not have any information available on the priest. So that is the original article, the one that caused all kinds of problems, because if you read it, it's not good. Now, for their part, the Pillar followed this up with a sort of new report with an update here. So here's the Pillar with their follow-up from just a couple of days ago. The headline, Relic Priest Responds to Incident Allegation. This is turning into a legal battle, which is going to get ugly. And the pushback Pillar has gotten from celebrities, lay Catholics, podcasters, I guess. It seems that everybody is against how Pillar handled this. J.D. Flynn, the editor, for his part, who is notorious for having hinted on X that he was quite pleased with Traditionis Custodes and the Pillar's role in making that possible. Poked at some other media outlet for bad reporting, and with a sort of and they say the Pillar's got problems. It's like, well, there are consequences for priests when it comes to this kind of reporting. That's why you have to be so careful with this stuff. So here, let's dive into this. He says, lawyers for a priest accused of an incident which halted a nationwide relic tour say that Father Carlos Martins touched a student's hair last week to build rapport, and that Illinois police are investigating the matter only at the insistence of a, quote, outraged father. Spokesperson for the Diocese of Joliet told the Pillar Monday that Martin's attorneys gave an incomplete account of a November 21st incident at Queen of Apostles Parish in Joliet, Illinois, adding that the diocese regarded the allegation as a matter of potential boundary issues, but not of misconduct involving sins of the flesh. Martin's attorney contacted the Pillar after Queen of the Apostles' announcement this weekend, which stated the parish had canceled public veneration of a relic and a connected mass after receiving reports of, quote, an incident with Martins and some students, which was reported to have happened in our church. And I will give you the account of what happened. It's, in my mind, it's mostly just imprudence on the part of the priest, but nothing really to be worried about. It's the lack of self-awareness, and I'll explain why in a moment. Well, the priest's attorney told the Pillar that a police complaint was filed by a parent. The parish announcement said parish priests had called the police in response to the reports, in accordance with the diocesan safe environment policies and our standards of behavior, though it is unclear if multiple reports were filed. The parish statement added that Joliet's Bishop Ron Hicks had decided to cancel the relic tour at 2 other Joliet parishes after he was informed of the situation. The police investigation is still ongoing, the parish statement said, adding that Martins himself was directed to depart from our parish and out of our diocese. Then it goes on to some of his background. Now, so far, that does clear some things up about the tour being canceled. The diocese and the priest followed the unfortunately necessary church policies on this kind of thing. Unfortunately necessary because 20 years ago, we all remember, life in the church, not just in the United States, but abroad, changed dramatically when various newspapers from the East Coast all pretty much simultaneously reported stories about priests committing the what now called the Ted McCarrick offenses. And that changed life in the church forever. 20 years later, we're still living in the shadow of that. Because as we go into the story, you're going to see that people immediately respond to anything from a priest with hostility. It's deeply embedded in us now to distrust our priests, and that is a great tragedy as a result of the infiltration in the church by people like Bella Dodd, putting men morally unfit to be there, who then did morally evil things to the most vulnerable. It's all part of the big dominoes of what happened to the church in the last 100 years, and we live under the consequences of that. But here's what really happened. So, back to the article. While Martins did not respond over the weekend to requests from the Pillar for comment and declined comment to other media outlets, his attorneys contacted the Pillar Monday to offer the priest's perspective on the allegations against him and to raise complaints about the Pillar's news coverage of the parish statement. The attorney's letter said that, quote, on November 21st, 2024, Queen of the Apostles Parish in the Diocese of Joliet, Illinois, hosted Father Martins to share the relic of St. Jude for public veneration. The parish invited its school to attend. Over 200 students attended the event, which was hosted in St. Paul Church. All the facts surrounding the Pillar's reporting happened in front of a large group of people encompassing multiple grades. As he always does, Father Carlos Martins began his interaction with the attendees in chit-chat dialogue. He is bald and apt to joke about it as a conversation starter. During his conversation with the older students, he made a comment to his students about her long hair, remarking, "You and I have almost the same hairstyle," a comment met with giggles. She has long hair, he has no hair. Get the joke he's telling? He then remarked that he also once had long hair like hers, and he joked he would, quote, floss my teeth with it. Again, his comment was met with laughter. He then asked the student, "Have you ever flossed with your hair?" Laughing, she shook her head no. He then said, "Well, you have the perfect length for it," as he lifted up a lock from her shoulders to show her its length. She giggled along with the others. He was building rapport. The student came home and told her father the story. He apparently became infuriated by what he heard, calling the police. The police arrived at the parish during the event and, after questioning the students, left without making any arrests or filing charges. It was only after the outraged father called the police a second time, insisting that they charge Father Martins with battery, that the police agreed to further investigate. "There's no indication that there's any new evidence that would further implicate my client of any wrongdoing. To date, no charges have been filed," the lawyer said. While Martin's attorney said that, quote, an outraged father called the police, the diocese told the Pillar that priests at the parish themselves made a police report in response to a report received about behaviors of the priest, end quote. Okay, so was this a problem? In an ideal world, no, it really would not be. But in the world we live in, where 20 years ago the McCarrick problem exploded in the newspapers, and for years after that the media breathlessly reported whenever a monster in the priesthood was outed, this action by the priest was imprudent to say the least. You may not be aware of this, but if you can get a priest to speak to you candidly about these kinds of things, you will find out that priests generally live in fear. I will give you a story. A now retired diocesan priest that I had gotten to know pretty well over the years before he retired said that he had a general rule of not allowing himself to ever be caught alone in a room with a child. Not because he was afraid of his own actions or what he would do, but because the times in during his ministry where he would suddenly find himself alone with a kid and then an adult would walk in, the look in that adult's eyes said everything. They live in fear that somebody will just say something and that will be the end. There is no recovering from allegations like this. So in that reality that we live in, where we have all been programmed deep down to some level because of men who should never have been in the priesthood in the first place and the evil things they did to the most vulnerable, Father Martin's actions were imprudent. And any priest will tell you candidly that they take steps to make sure they are never alone with somebody that young. Again, it's not because of their own behavior. They're not facing temptations because these are, again, for the most part, normal human beings who these kinds of things would never even occur to. But because all it takes is one allegation to destroy a priest forever. Just one. There's no recovering from that kind of allegation. It will follow a priest forever. 30 years from now, Father Carlos Martins will still have this hanging over him, and it will certainly follow him for the rest of his career, for the rest of his life. Now, Rod Dreher, someone I don't agree with a lot because, he left Catholicism and critiques it years after leaving. He, however, has some interesting thoughts on this story, and I think it's worth going over. So we go to his blog here, his Substack, with the headline, Smearing Father Carlos Martins. Because this it was a smear job. Now, I don't think J.D. Flynn and the Pillar did that on purpose. Again, we're talking about imprudence here. When it comes to stories like this, there's always the other shoe that drops. Always. That's why I didn't report on the Father Jackson story for the FSSP, if you remember. Church Militant breathlessly reported on all of it. I still find that story extremely fishy, even though the priest took responsibility for and admitted, I guess, as part of a plea deal to looking at some of the most diabolical kind of stuff on the internet. Part of the reason I find that story so fishy is because numerous people who knew him in life said that the guy could barely get on the internet without help. So how he would be looking at that kind of stuff, that's not exactly the easiest to find for a normal person. Who knows? That's why I found that story and still do find it fishy. But you have to tread so carefully with this. The priests are, these are essentially apostolic men. They serve our Lord. And the world wants nothing more than to destroy priests. This is why the priests who promote heresy, I come after so hard, because they make the jobs of the enemies of the church so easy. They bring souls down. But sometimes an otherwise decent priests get caught up in this stuff, as is the case here. We'll go to Rod Dreher, what he had to say in the closing part of his piece on here. He says, quote, Note well that this happened right after his excellent new book, The Exorcist Files, was released. It's not only the only bad thing that has happened surrounding the book's publication. Shortly before, Father Martins had an accident that broke 2 of his ribs, and his literary agent heard a noise in his house and went downstairs to find that a pipe had burst, flooding the first house. The agent, an older man, slipped on wet tile, broke 2 ribs, and sustained a head injury. Now this is not exculpatory in the Martins case, heaven knows, or in any particular case, but you should know that veteran exorcists are used to this kind of thing. Another exorcist of my acquaintance endured a false claim along the lines of what Father Martins now suffers. The enemy will take an opportunity he can to destroy exorcists. You will all know exactly what I'm talking about when police file the results of their investigation, and I report it here. The Diocese of Joliet has a shameful record of hiding McCarrick kinds of problems, which no doubt accounts for its throwing poor Father Martins to the dogs over an absurd and malicious accusation. Again, you'll see. Wait. Withhold judgment. As I see it, this is another case of a blameless priest having to pay the price for the crimes of wicked priests and the long-standing contemptible indifference of Catholic bishops. End quote. Earlier in that piece, he says he has information he cannot make public about this case until law enforcement finishes its job, but it will completely exonerate the priest. Bear that in mind. The consequences of this kind of reporting can have a ripple effect throughout the church for priests in other ways. So, for example, we go to the Catholic Herald for this. Because, again, these things that are done to priests don't happen in isolation. So the headline, Exorcists today have an even harder job when the supernatural rumor mill and internet collide, by Gavin Ashenden, published yesterday at the Catholic Herald. An issue here is something that will probably be an unpopular take for many of you watching. Growing numbers of us are becoming more and more uncomfortable with the phenomenon of the celebrity exorcist. Until very recently, exorcists operated in virtually every diocese in the church around the world, and they did so anonymously. Your diocese would not disclose the identity of the official exorcist of the diocese or even of the priest commissioned to assist him. Now, exorcists have YouTube channels, give interviews, go on speaking tours and press junkets. That's not to say that Father Carlos Martins, or the most well-known of all of living celebrity exorcists, Father Chad Ripperger, are bad priests or be discounted in any way. Far from it. But could the church do better with a return to the traditional way of exorcists operating? Think about that as we look at the consequences of this, because Mr. Ashenden's article here touches on that question, the obvious thing left out in the entire discussion about Father Carlos Martins. So that obvious thing left out is the metaphysical or supernatural side of the discussion. So let's get a closer look at this article for all of our edification here. And we go to here. All right. So, from the article, quote, if you take a metaphysical view of these things, you might wonder if this was an example of the liberal clergy of the parish, uncomfortable with a visit by a well known exorcist, accompanied by his relics and directing people's attention to the reality of the supernatural, taking the opportunity to trash him and his tour. You might perhaps take it even as an indication that there could be resident demons glad to be rid of an expert in evangelization and deliverance. Whatever diagnostic route you prefer, it is clear that instead of considering the father's rage as perhaps an indication of overprotective idiosyncratic antipathy towards the church, the parish clergy seem to have used it as a weapon against their visiting colleague. The pillar has been upbraided for going to press so swiftly and feeding the fire of misapprehension. Photographs of the parish pastor who wrote the press release with his own hands on the shoulders of young children have begun to emerge. They suggest double standards of an unhappy kind. Leaving aside the possible envy or discomfort of the parish priest, the rage of a father told somebody touched his daughter's hair, the speed of the internet, as well as the danger of a reputation being lost in a nanosecond forever. This cautionary tale suggests a wider dimension. It is the fault line between those uncomfortable with the supernatural dimension of the Catholic faith and those who are committed to a life informed by the long practiced spirituality of the church. One of the reasons that exorcists are the new celebrities on the internet may be because of the way in which they offer what they offer are acts that serve as an antidote to the neo-paganism of a post-atheist society. The conversion of the West was achieved partly because the monk evangelists who spread the faith, such as St. Martin of Tours, St. Patrick, St. Boniface, St. Wilfrid, et al., were so successful at dealing with demonic oppression that pagan society suffered from. Now, with the sudden, if unexpected, emergence of contemporary neo-paganism, the experience, expertise, authority, and impact of priests affected in the ministry of deliverance has a role to play that may well shape the future of the interaction between a post-Christian society and the Catholic Church. Lawyers have written to the pillar asking them to help restore the reputation of Father Carlos by making it explicit that there was no hint of any fleshly misdemeanor and the guarding overexcitement that cascaded into a crisis without cause. It might even be the case, as Father Gabriel Amorth so memorably inferred, that here there has been an instance where the demons found a platform within the church even more effective than they do outside it. In the meantime, look out for a review of the Exorcist files in the Catholic Herald, etc. There is a supernatural dimension to this story. There just is. You cannot think about what it is an exorcist does, the battles they wage for the church and for the salvation of souls, and not think that there's some sort of supernatural aspect to this. It is unfortunate, as Alexa says here in the chat, that it appears in this society the rule of thumb for priests is avoid any physical contact with anyone, even done in jest. Red legs will be used to destroy them, as in this case. Precisely. They can basically only make physical contact with somebody if it's part of their ministry. And then probably best to have a person or two with them to make sure that they can be protected. That is where we are. Because normally, do you think the dad of the kid would probably be that upset? Probably not as with that reaction. But we have all been trained in the last 20 years, and really longer than that, because of what happened 20 years ago with the McCarrick stuff, evil priests hiding, wolves in shepherd's clothing. Because of that, we have been trained to have this gut reaction to it. And I say longer than 20 years because I remember back in the 1990s, before I was a Catholic, rock bands I liked would make songs about these evil priests. We knew, everybody knew for at least a decade beforehand, maybe even in the 80s. I read some accounts of people knowing back in the 80s that this was a problem, but the media didn't report on it until the 2000s in a concerted way. And that issue here is another thing that I think, and this is an unpopular take, growing numbers of us are becoming more and more uncomfortable with the phenomenon of the celebrity exorcist. Until very recently, exorcists were anonymous. Your diocese would not disclose the identity of the official exorcist of the diocese, or even of the priest commissioned to assist him. And now they've got YouTube channels, podcasts, they write books, they go on tours, they speak at conventions. Now, a counter argument to that, how uncomfortable some of us are with this, is that, well, the supernatural pagan stuff is so mainstream now. that you need to have the exorcist be something that people are almost used to seeing, who can publicly rebuke this stuff and give the countervailing argument for the salvation of souls. I get that counter argument, but a lot of that can just be done by either former exorcists. Like, I would have a far less of a problem if a retired exorcist, a priest who said, I was an exorcist and I can tell you how it works, but not someone who's active. Especially when you consider the supernatural dimension to this. We are at war with princes and principalities. Those are the forces of the devil in the most literal sense of the word. Please take that seriously, and please pray for the priests of your diocese. This is why you should be praying for your priests. Maybe your diocese keeps who your exorcist is under wraps and you have no idea, but maybe your parish priest, who happens to be gone frequently for random seeming reasons, he might actually be your diocesan exorcist for all you know. Pray for your priests. They face spiritual battles that none of us can understand. Speaking of spiritual battles that most of us can't understand, on an entirely different note, I can't wait until the powers that should not be in the imperial capital here in America are gone. I cannot wait. As you'll see with this story here, related to everything else we've been talking about, this comes to us from Michael Haynes on X. He's a LifeSite News reporter. Vatican, US State Secretary Blinken met with Pope Francis today, then Cardinal Parolin, who was often talked about as being a potential successor to Francis, being basically the front runner, and Archbishop Gallagher. Amidst discussion of worldwide politics, Blinken praised, quote, the Pope's commitment to advancing the basic rights and dignity of the James Martin crowd, per press release. And here is video of their encounter.
So wonderful to see you again. Thank you for this evening. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for these wonderful memories of my visit now almost 4 years ago.
Note how pleased Francis is to be meeting with the American diplomat here. Usually the Vatican, usually the person they send to the Vatican is a Catholic. I don't know if Secretary Blinken is, but given the demeanor and behavior of his family, I suspect that he is. If you look at pictures and the footage of the meetings with the very Catholic president's predecessor, the once and future president, very different body language. They're very pleased to be having this meeting. And you see here a gift being given, a ceremonial thing. Pretty common occurrence here. But yes, Secretary Blinken told Francis how wonderful it was he was a defender of the James Martin crowd and a promoter of them. Like I said, I can't wait. I can't wait until they're gone. I really can't. And it's not to say the once and future president has a hardline, actual Catholic position on the James Martin crowd. They don't. He doesn't. But the government won't be used to promote this stuff on the worldwide stage under him. Or if it is, it'll be much more subtle, not so in your face. The American embassy in Vatican City has had the evil flag of the James Martin crowd flying from the flagpole there in Vatican City. That's the kind of folks we're dealing with. And I, for one, cannot wait until they're gone. Let the man who, the very Catholic man who is, I'm saying that in quotes sarcastically, let him go sail off into retirement, spend time with his grandkids, and hopefully we will be done with the rest of these folks in government forever. Yes, Trish Catholic just mentioned that Blinken thanked the Holy Father for his efforts for the James Martin crowd. Yes. Yeah. That's what we're talking about here. And the funny thing is, the Vatican will downplay the efforts for the James Martin crowd. Oh, synodality. It's all being taught about everybody being welcomed and all that. But the forces outside the church, they're not fooled by it at all. They see them as their fellow travelers, as their allies in promoting these sins that cry out to heaven for justice. That's what they see. They see it because they're being much more honest. They have nothing to lose on this. Whereas the Vatican has to be more careful with how they talk about this as they work to change the teachings of the church. That's why James Martin has such access to CNN, why he's an advisor on Hollywood projects about Catholicism, is because of that issue. Sabrina says, "Do I think the Pope knows he's wrong in his worldview of faith? Is it deliberate, or is he that lost?" I believe he is a true believer in what he's doing. The modernists are true believers. They believe God sent them to fix the church. They believe in, you may have heard from Protestants this idea called the Babylonian captivity. Their belief is, there's a whole lot of different beliefs that they have, but some Protestants believe in this Babylonian captivity, which is that Jesus founded an actual visible church, but that it went off the rails sometime after the death of the last apostle, and that the true church went underground. Constantine is often talked about in this way. And then Martin Luther saved Jesus's church. Jesus is so lucky to have had Martin Luther and Henry VIII and all the rest of those scoundrels, right? The modernist version of the Babylonian captivity is that essentially the Catholic Church is the church founded by Jesus Christ on the Rock of Peter, but that it became rigid and clericalist, and the true faith was hidden away by people, theologians who quietly questioned things, until finally, after many struggles against really rigid types like Pius X and the rest, at Vatican II, they were able to save the church, and that Jesus is so lucky to have the modernists who at Vatican II saved the church. It's on all their language, the way they talk about this stuff. It's why they talked about synodality being a continuation of Vatican II and the spirit of Vatican II. Many of them are absolutely true believers in this mission. That's why they're so dangerous. They should be taken much more dangerously. Phoenix Cycle has, how is the relationship between the Pope and the incoming president? Tepid. He met with him as a diplomatic thing, and that was about it. And I mean, he has counter-signaled his policies all the time and still does. I mean, the American bishops just said some really silly, absurd things about certain of his hot-button issues that have like broad support in the culture. All right, folks. Well, thanks very much for tuning in. I do want to give a shout out to Steve Katz, who's a new member of the channel. I will remind people, if you are a channel member, you hit that join button and you are a channel member. During my live streams, you get a free super chat once a month. It's a feature given to you by YouTube. Take advantage of it. Because a super chat, I see it, I go, oh, hey, I got a super chat, and I see it, and then I bring it up on screen and answer your question. It's a great way for me to guarantee that you will get your questions answered during these live streams, as well as all the other perks of supporting the work I do here. And speaking of that, if you've ever thought about supporting the work of Return to Tradition, now's a great time to do so. Links, options in the description below. It keeps these daily messages coming. Finally, I will tell people that make sure you have a happy Thanksgiving today. If you're in the United States, if you're outside the United States, well, have a good Thursday, I guess. But please, 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 please pray for the church and, all the rest of the thing. If you have any final thoughts in the comments, here's your opportunity to get them in now. I do find it interesting, again, that a couple of Catholic celebrities took on a pretty big risk on defending the priest, because there are risks that come with that, especially if it turned out something bad had happened, even though in this case of this, it's pretty obvious. Team Oz uses free super chat. There you go. Happy Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving to you. And again, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.